Well, before we begin, I was just thinking about Rajat and my association with him during our ISB days. You know, it's very difficult to describe this multifaceted individual. Many people call him a philanthropist. A lot of people call him a very, very charismatic leader. He's been very inspirational. More recently, you know, a lot of people have applauded his courage to speak up and talk about his trials and tribulation. Well, Rajat, where I am concerned, you know, I'm walking back down the memory line, and the last time we were together was after a board meeting at ISB, where I was talking about, this was the early days of ISB, by the way, in the early 2000, where everyone said ISB is poised to fail, if you remember those days. Right? It was a very novel concept, shrinking a 2-year program into a 1-year MBA. Getting like-minded folks from the industry, it was unheard of at that time to start an education institute, to bypass government regulations, not awarding degrees, just awarding certificates and charging twice as much. You know, ISB, you are bound to fail, and that's what, you know, we heard from every direction. And I was honestly facing severe palpitations. And, you know, after a board meeting, we had a side talk, and I said, Rajat, you know, I'm facing severe palpitations, kya kare? You know, will ISB survive, or what is it? And I clearly remember what Rajat said at that time. And he says, look, we've thought about this. We've got data backing us. We've done our analytics, number one. Is for a just cause. And when you are pursuing something for a just cause, listen to your heart and remove fear from your mind. This is what you said, if you remember. And when I looked at the title of your book, it just transported me back to those days and those conversations we had. And Rajat, you are so right. And people call you a visionary. And I think that's the word I would use to describe Rajat Gupta. He is a visionary. And once again, a big warm welcome to our visionary at Flame University. But I won't call you a visionary, I will call you a courageous visionary. Because you have decided to step up more recently, to talk about your experiences, knowing that it's not going to be easy. Knowing that people are going to mock again, knowing that people are going to say, there Rajat goes again. But you've decided to stand up and speak up the truth. And I admire you for your courage, Rajat. And that brings back to my first question for our interaction. So who is Rajat Gupta today? And take us into his mind without fear.
Well, let me first start by thanking all of you for being here, for inviting me for this conversation. I have to also tell you that my association with Dishan goes a long time. And I still remember when we were able to attract him as a faculty member, we were all at the board very excited. He soon proved to be more than worthy of that excitement. He was always rated the #1 faculty member in ISB as far as I can remember. And was the youngest to get tenure at ISB. We were very sad to see him go, but very glad for the challenge he was taking on. I will start with a little vignette, what happens in McKinsey when you are managing partner. You are really the chief human resource officer. All the partners come to you with all their troubles and all their opportunities. the most frequent conversation I had with my fellow partners was because they got a very attractive opportunity, and they would come to me and say, "Oh, should I take this opportunity? Should I take this job?" And the first thing I would do, and I resolved in my mind, the knee-jerk reaction would be, "Oh, this is a great loss to the institution. Do everything you can to keep the person." But I had come to my mind that it should be exactly the opposite. So think about how the individual, put yourself in the individual's shoes. Think about what is the opportunity offering in terms of learning, in terms of opportunity for fast growth, in terms of professional development, in terms of leadership. And that's where I would start the conversation. And I would understand where they're going to and what is happening to them and what is the opportunity. And sometimes I would say, it'll be a great loss to McKinsey, but that's what you ought to do because that's a great challenge in front of you. And I would say the same for you. Even though it's a great loss for ISB, you made a good choice. And you have a wonderful opportunity here to look forward and build this institution that is poised to be a great institution. So I'm delighted to be here. You asked this very broad question.
Right.
Who am I? I don't know how to quite answer that honestly, but maybe I turn the question around and say, what drove me in different times of my own career?
Sure.
First, early on, I always felt that the main task of somebody starting out is to become a better professional. The first thing I would say to many of the students that are here today is that when you get out in the world, your job is to become a better, whatever field you have chosen, a better professional in that field. Less you worry about how's my career going and what is my next career step. Instead, focus on what is my professional step and what is my learning and how do I get on to assignments or jobs which offer me the highest learning potential. Maybe it'll delay your career advancement or your promotion or whatever. So there's a big difference between career development and professional development. Most people I see now are looking at saying, how do I get to the next step in the ladder?
Right.
I don't think that's quite the right thing. I personally benefited from that practice. I was very late in McKinsey in terms of getting elected partner and so on and so forth. But it stood me in good stead. I would say the other thought I have in terms of what's defining me, as you start the question, I'm answering it in a roundabout way, is that whenever I got comfortable with something, I was being very good at it, I was getting comfortable, it was wanted to change. Whenever you're in your comfort zone, do something different, because that's when learning happens. It doesn't happen when you're comfortable and happy and high performing. You have to take yourself out of that comfort zone. So that is also one thing that has defined my life in terms of what I've done. In business is that business, it operates with the permission of society. It has an obligation to give back to society. Markets, your products, your demand won't exist unless society functions well. So it's very important that business gives back to society. The second important thing I discovered is this business has some unique skills. And those skills are very important in solving societal problems. So the most difficult, intractable social problems, whether it be solving healthcare here or primary education system in the country, all of this best done by a combination of a public-private partnership of society, civil society, government, and business. And business brings certain kinds of skills to it. So I've always felt, even when I was the head of McKinsey, I spent a lot of time in thinking through how do I give back to society. I was born in this country. This is my country of my birth. I'm owe a lot to my early education. I went to IIT here. And I always felt that I needed to give back to this country. I also am very loyal to the country that I've adopted. And I've done a lot in a similar vein in US and around the world. So there's a focus in me of saying, as a business leader, what can I give back? So those are the types of things that have driven my own career and who I am. I went through, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about it during the course of this dialogue, a very difficult time in the last 4 or 5 years. But one thing is very clear, is that you learn the most in adverse conditions. That's where, again, the learning comes. And as they say, if it doesn't kill you, you'll become stronger.
Right.
So over to you for some more, maybe specific questions. This is very broad.
So we'll start with broad-based questions, and I'll continue to ask you another broad-based question before we get into the specifics.
You're the moderator.
Yeah. So so Rajat, you've always been known as as a philanthropist, and you played a very important role in creating a large pool of public health fund. Can you tell us more about your philanthropic activities?
So all of you, or some of you, know about Indian School of Business. I won't talk very much about it. But quite simply, I would say it was a unique experiment. It was a unique experiment in getting multiple industrial leaders to get together and start a world-class institution. It's very difficult to get these business tycoons in a room, let alone collaborate on a venture. So in that sense, it was a great experiment to see if we can get the Tatas and the Ambanis and the Bajajes and everybody together around a table and everybody collaborating and creating a school. It was actually quite a pioneering experiment, and you see a number of people then stepping up and creating institutions that are modeled after the ISB. And while this is not a business school, it's a liberal arts school, but I see many elements of some of the innovative ideas we started there being adopted here. And of course, you are a product of ISB. We'll always claim that, no matter where you go. So you must borrow that. But let me say, we start with a little incident. 3 years, I think it was 3 years or so after third batch, I came to the graduation at ISB. And I flew back from India back to the US. And I used to sit on the board of the Harvard School of Public Health. And so there was a board meeting the next day. And I was having breakfast with the dean. So I was very proud. I said, we just had this graduation. We graduated 200 MBAs, etc. So the guy says, I said, I started a business school and it's doing well. He said, starting a business school? That's very easy. Why are you strutting around so much about starting a business school? If you really want to make a difference, start some schools of public health. He says the state of the health of the country in India, he knew India very well. He'd done research in tuberculosis in India. And he said that the state of the health of the country is very poor.
Right.
Without health, which is a basic human right, no human being can actually realize their full potential. So I said to him, if you'll help me, I will start a school of public health.
Right.
So he said yes. And that's how the idea of the schools of public health came about. And we created a public-private partnership, which was 1/3 of the funds came from the government, 1/3 came from foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and 1/3 from private sector. And that's how the thing started. We had some very innovative things that we did. We started 5 campuses around the country. And I was telling just now, we were having a conversation about creating faculty, which is the biggest problem in many of these institutions. So we sort of sponsored our own faculty, created our own faculty, or manufactured our own faculty by sponsoring PhD students in universities all around the world. And all they had to do was to commit to come and teach, do research in PHFI for 5 years. And we built up a faculty strength of about 800 in 5 to 7 years.
That's amazing.
These are PhDs and masters, etc., from the world's leading universities, all coming back here and helping in the public health effort. I can go on and on, but I can give you one more example of a
sure.
public health thing that is very fascinating, which is an organization called the Global Fund for AIDS, Malaria, and Tuberculosis. I don't know how many of you would have heard about it. It's the world's largest health fund. It distributes about $4 billion a year to different countries to defeat these 3 diseases: AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. It's a public-private partnership. Governments and foundations and private sector donates money. Mostly it's government monies. But what is unique about it is that private sector lends its hand in terms of skills and capabilities needed to execute the programs. I'll give you a simple example. In 10 years ago or so, or 15 years ago, there used to be about 1 million children died of malaria. This was a staggering number. And the cure is very simple. You have insecticide-impregnated bed nets. You make sure you sleep under them. There's a very cheap drug called ACT available, which if you get malaria, if you get ACT, you will be cured. So the technology was well known, it was simple. The issue was, how do we get several 100 million bed nets to the point where it should be, and that it be used in the right way. And that was a business problem. Right. How do you get this distribution of nets and the medicines out to the most remote villages in Africa and make sure that the people are trained on how to use it and to sleep under it? That program was extremely successful, and today the malaria deaths are 400,000 a year from 1 million. So a dramatic impact when people work together.
Right. And in our recent conversation, you talked about your inclination to continue your focal thrusts in public health as well.
Sure.
So Rajat, I'm going to be more specific now with regards to the adversity that you've been through.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've been following some of the interviews, and you talked about your inability to testify in court. So I've got 2 questions in regards. If you were able to testify, what would you have said? And second question is, why didn't you?
So I'm glad you said the last question, because I had a choice. It was not my inability. I mean, I made a choice not to testify. What I would have said, you asked the question, what I would have said.
Yeah.
what I would have said is what the book is about. And I say that I did not testify on the advice of my lawyers, and in the end, it was in the end my decision. I chose not to testify. And I'll come back to why that was. But I laid it out all in the book. I basically wanted to give this as my testimony, what I would have said, and how I would have created the narrative that I believe is the true narrative instead of what the prosecutors presented. It's a long narrative, it's a complex narrative, so I don't want to go into it all right now because you really have to read the book. But I'll say a few things about it. The prosecutors were quite skillful in weaving a believable but untrue story. And the first thing to say about it is that what is the context in which this was happening? Mm-hmm. The US had gone through the most severe recession since the Depression in the 30s, 28, 30 time frame in 2008. It was a devastating event for much of the mainstream America. They were losing their jobs, they were losing their homes, they were losing their pensions. There was an enormous anger at how this could happen and how the financial industry, through their own methods and practices, led the country to this kind of a crisis. We had to act fast, and Hank Paulson was then the Treasury Secretary, who I knew very well, in fact, invited me to join the Goldman board, and President Bush launched a rescue program for all the financial institutions. And we rescued the banks and the finance companies and so on, which was essential. But what we didn't do following up is really understand who were the perpetrators of this crisis, and we didn't bring to account any of them. So the real perpetrators of this crisis were banking companies, housing finance companies, rating companies that, the companies that put all the bonds together and collateralized them into an obligation, and excess leverage on top of that and so on. The public was clamoring for some justice. They had suffered incredibly, and yet we were not able to bring anybody. So what did the prosecutor do? They went for hedge funds. I mean, the hedge funds never really did contribute to the financial crisis. They are just trading firms
Right.
that go on the market. And they got Rajaratnam, and then they went after me because I had some investments together with him and so on, and weaved a story of insider trading. Now, to give a simple education on what insider trading is, you have to have passed inside market-moving information to someone. You have to have a personal gain or a quid pro quo. I give you information, I get some gain. It has to be significant gain, either financial or otherwise. And you have to do it with a criminal intent.
Right.
That you actually had a motive to do that. There were months and months of conversations recorded. In no conversation was I caught giving any specific information to Rajaratnam, which was market moving and insider trading.
Right.
They never proved any benefit. In fact, in the end, they admitted I had no financial benefit of any kind.
Right.
I had boardroom secrets for 35 years. There was not a single case of any issue of market information, confidential information in any of my dialogues. I did many mergers and acquisitions where, I advised them, and one of the biggest mergers in US history was P&G acquiring Gillette, which was one of the biggest ones. I actually was an advisor to both sides and created that. In my life, I've never traded on any stocks, never got any information. Rajaratnam's Galleon Fund, there were maybe about 25 or so cases related to insider trading. In every one of them, they had taped conversations. They had proof of Rajaratnam paying them money, a quid pro quo arrangement. In my case, there was none. And I was the only one that didn't have any quid pro quo arrangement that they could describe.
Right.
So all I have to say is that, in the end, they wove a very believable but untrue story. My lawyers didn't particularly do a great job because they kept telling me, oh, there is no case. Don't worry about it. There's no case. And they said they have to prove you're guilty, not you have to prove you're innocent.
Right.
How do you prove you're innocent, kind of thing. So that was just a little context around the case. Why I didn't, in the end, testify. You asked that question. I always wanted to testify. And I told my lawyers, I want to testify. And they said, yes, but really our advice is you should not. But if you insist, I kept insisting, but they wouldn't prepare me. I said, when am I getting prepared as to what you're going to ask me, what you think the prosecutors are going to ask me, prepare me for it. They kind of said, yeah, we'll come to that. We have to prepare cross-examination of somebody, etc., etc. The trial started, and they hadn't still prepared me well. So I would go to the office and say, prepare me. The trial itself was a very depressing thing and demoralizing thing for me because I saw the government continuously lying and getting away with it. I saw the judge make rulings against me all the time. So after about 3 weeks, I must say I felt beaten down. And that weekend, so on Friday, we were to defend our case on Monday. We told the judge on Friday, yes, I'm testifying. Because I told my lawyers, I am testifying.
Right.
So I went over the weekend to prepare, and they kept saying, no, you shouldn't testify, and so on. And I must say and that's in a way where the title comes from. The title comes from both sides. Firstly, the title is borrowed from a great poem by Rabindranath Tagore in the collection of poems called Gitanjali. It was my favorite collection. He won the Nobel Prize on it. I named my daughter, my oldest daughter, Gitanjali, because I loved the collection of poems. And in that collection, there is one poem, which is where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. So it was a two-way thing. Most of my life I've dealt with being unafraid, leading a life without fear. But at the same time, that weekend, I have to admit I succumbed to fear because I didn't know the unknown. My lawyers kept telling me, this is the wrong thing, you should not testify.
Right.
My family was afraid of me testifying and being subjected to the cross-examination. And I had been beaten down for 3 weeks in listening to the government's trial. And I must say I succumbed to fear.
Right. It wouldn't have been easy at all. You just mentioned Rajaratnam, right? Rajaratnam, right? And one question that comes to my mind again is, he removed money from the voyage fund. You could have sued him. Why not?
So again, the issues are not as simple as they sound. So the Voyager Fund, was first started by 3 partners. There's a guy named Ravi Trehan, myself, and Rajaratnam. Soon afterwards, so the structure of the fund was Ravi Trehan and Rajaratnam were both money managers, investment managers. They managed funds. So they were going to manage half the fund each, and I was just a passive investor. So I trusted them both. They were, I'd known Rajaratnam, and Ravi was a very good friend of mine. So I said, you guys have the signature authority. I don't need to sign things and so on. And so they had the signature authority. Raj and Ravi started fighting. Ravi left. So at that time, I didn't even think, but Raj was the only signature authority on the fund. Now, what he did was, so when the fund was there, then I was 20% owner, he was 40% owner. It was a 50 million equity. It was 10 million of mine and 40 million of his. Mm-hmm. He didn't tell me, but later on I came to know, in April of 2008 or so, that he had withdrawn 48 million. He had put in 40 million, had withdrawn 48 million. He had withdrawn 23 million in equity, right, and 25 million in commissions, which was not very clear in the contract. I mean, this was a friends and family thing. It should not have been any fees that he was going to charge, but he took out. Now, that taking out was actually not illegal, because you can always take out equity. The fund had done well. The only thing is that I should have got an opportunity to take out proportional amount of my equity. Right. So if he took out 23 million, I should have been able to take out 4 or 5 million of my equity. And he should have disclosed to me that he's charging 25 million in fees, which he didn't. And in fact, he was recorded on tape saying, oh, I didn't tell Rajat that I'd taken out all this money. We'll have to make up some excuse and tell him later on. Mm-hmm. Now, the fund actually went to zero for the reason that he had taken out all the equity. And it was a leverage fund. When the market went down, the fund went to zero. So technically, on a legal basis, I was trying to talk with lawyers and find out if I have a basis to sue him. I mean, he violated my trust. That was the most important thing. Yeah. But I'm not sure there was a legal case to sue him. But, it was like, I never could have imagined that somebody who's as wealthy as he is would take out money and not treat a fair partnership and let me take out my money too.
Right. Well, I'm coming to another name with respect to your case here, and I'm pointing my fingers at the U.S. attorney, Preet Bharara. Preet Bharara, Rajaratnam, they are 2 individuals at the epicenter of the entire case that you dealt with, Rajat. But you seem to blame the U.S. attorney Preet Bharara more than Rajaratnam in most of your interviews that I've seen. Why is that?
It's not a question of blaming somebody more or less. When I met Rajaratnam for the first time in prison, I told him, you are the reason I'm here.
Right.
The issue about Preet is something different. The U.S. criminal justice system gives almost unchecked powers to prosecutors. Prosecutors almost habitually overreach, and they do things which you would think are actually quite illegal, but the government can do them. Preet Bharara had these great headlines, he's busting Wall Street, but he didn't get a single person from Wall Street. He got a couple of people from hedge funds. So people expected that he would go after the real perpetrators of the financial crisis.
Right.
And he didn't. There is a book that has come out now, it's called The Chicken Shit Club. Mm-hmm. And The Chicken Shit Club is about prosecutors who don't go after the real perpetrators, who are maybe too powerful or too difficult for they all have political ambitions. They also want to become governors and so on, later. So they don't want to offend powerful people, or they can't get after them. And he went after Rajaratnam. He couldn't get at Stevie Cohn, who was a much bigger fish in terms of hedge fund world. And I retired from McKinsey. I was a well-known person, but not very powerful person. So it's sort of the definition of chicken shit club. If I can go after them, go after them. And so it was the overreach. And the other thing I would say is that the reason I'm really quite strongly blame the prosecutorial system, and Preet Bharara is not alone, but in my case, he did 2 or 3 things that were, I believe, extremely damaging and borderline on unfair tactics. I'll say a couple of things. One is that when the first thing is that I was told that there is something, my name has come up in some Rajaratnam tapes, but I had no idea what the investigation was about or what it was about. This went on for 14, 15 months. And periodically they would leak stories to the press that will say Rajat Gupta, Goldman board member, is rumored to have this, that, or the other investigation going on. My lawyer would call both the SEC and the Justice Department and say, please tell us what's going on. We can, we're happy to come and tell you. Nothing. So I was in the dark like fighting a shadow. The second thing was that in SEC you get something called a Wells notice. This is the first time you learn that an investigation is going on. And you have, I forget, 30 or 60 days to reply. So the reply was on a Friday, and they decided to sue me on a Monday. This is a 60-page reply with arguments we made about why they should not press charges against me. I am pretty sure over the weekend they didn't. If they read it very cursorily. They didn't analyze it. They'd already decided to sue me. Now, the reason they decided to bring me charges on March 1st or 2nd, I forget, was because Rajaratnam's trial was going to happen the next week. And they wanted to bring my charges before Rajaratnam's trial, because at Rajaratnam's trial, it was as if I was being tried in absentia. Most of the headlines during that time period was about me, not Rajaratnam. And Rajaratnam was never charged on either Goldman Sachs or P&G. That was not one of his charges. And yet, they would continuously play tapes of one conversation I had with it, which had nothing to do with insider trading, and keep bringing my name, even though he was not charged on Goldman or P&G. I can go on and give you some of the unfair things they did. They kept saying I owned 15% of Galleon International. Simply was not true. They knew it was not true because they had combed through my finances and books and all that. They knew it was not true, but they would continuously say, because it fit their narrative. It fit their narrative that there was a benefit. There was no benefit. So that was, what was the benefit? You own 15% of Galleon. Not true. So I can cite many more examples. I'll stop here. So the reason I feel really, in a sense, bad about it is that somebody like Preet Bharara, who's obviously a talented guy, succumbed to just trying to win at all costs. He was not in search of the truth.
Right.
He was in search of winning.
Right. Well, with all this episode, Rajat, what have been your lessons from the way Wall Street operates? And now if you look at the Wall Street from an outsider perspective, and if you look at the financial crisis of 2008, will you have a very different perspective?
Well, I've said this before. I think we were remiss in holding the real perpetrators of the crisis to justice. Second thing I would say is that this is not about Wall Street, but the justice system have misaligned incentives. And they have tools that are really reasonably unfair. I'll tell you, for example, Anil Kumar testified against me at the trial, did not know anything about the case. He didn't know anything about Voyager Fund, he didn't know anything about the case, about the trading, any of it. He was caught in an insider trading, actual wiretap conversation. So what does the government do? They offer him a plea deal, what's called a plea bargain, that if you admit your guilt and if you agree to testify against whoever we want you to testify against, we will give you a lenient sentence. So he didn't go to prison. But what happens in that plea bargain is you basically sell your soul.
Yeah, absolutely.
You basically sell your soul. You will do whatever the prosecutors ask you to do. You will say whatever the prosecutors ask you to say.
Right, right.
And unfortunately, that's what he did. And these are types of tactics which I think need reform. This is ridiculous, you know. And there are so many other things that are unfair about the justice system. About Wall Street, my own feeling is that which got corrected, but now is sort of reverting back, is when I was at the Goldman board, I used to often wonder, this is very strange. And I would ask at the board meeting, a number of us used to ask, how can you be on every side of the deal? How can you be on the buying side, the selling side? You're trading on your own account. You are the broker. I mean, you're doing four sides. How is that possible? And how is it that you can avoid conflicts? And they would say, we have Chinese walls here and Chinese walls there. But that clearly was one of the reasons where there was unchecked risk-taking, over-leverage, and the whole thing collapsed. So that got reformed a bit, but it's sort of creeping back.
You know, unchecked risk-taking, and I'm going to just ask you two more questions, and then we'll open up to the floor.
Sure.
I want to get into, you know, your experience with unchecked power, and you know where I'm getting at.
Yeah, I know where you're getting.
So what was prison like for you?
He's talking about prison. You know, as I was preparing to go for prison, the context I had with it had to do with my father. My father was a freedom fighter. He spent 10 years coming in and out of jails. And he was very badly tortured when he was in prison. And when as a result, he was not in good health. He had, they knowingly put him in a cell with a tuberculosis patient. He contracted tuberculosis, he almost died, one of his lungs had to be taken out. He was beaten badly and, you know, his back was split and one of his legs became shorter than the other because of the badly way they stitched him up. So he was tortured a lot and his health suffered as a result. And he was a journalist, an editor of a newspaper. I didn't see him very much because he had to get a newspaper out every day. But when he got sick, and especially the last 2 years of his life, he was quite a bit in hospitals. And I would go from school back to the hospital and I would take him for a walk and he would talk about his life, he'd talk about his prison term. But one thing that was clear, he was never bitter. He was never angry. He never said a word against the British or his jailers or anyone. So when I was going to prison, all these conversations and these memories would flood into my mind. And I determined when I went to prison, I said, it's like entering a monastery. I'm going to work, I'm going to lead a very simple life, and I'm going to work very hard towards making myself come out better physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And I prepared myself for that. I was regularly walking and doing exercises and reading a lot and so on. But one thing that was striking, and I was coping reasonably well with prison, but one thing that was striking, and this refers to your conversation, as all of you understand, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the prison guards have an absolute power over you. They can do anything they want. And for the flimsiest of excuses, they sent me to solitary confinement twice, once for a week and once for 7 weeks. And to me, solitary confinement is like involuntary vipassana. You have nobody to talk to. And 7 weeks is a pretty long time, you know. I have to tell you.
Based on Geneva Convention.
It's in the Geneva Convention. It's like torture. It's solitary confinement.
Right. But it shouldn't be extended beyond 2 weeks.
2 weeks,
Am I
right? That's correct. 2 weeks is the maximum. But doesn't apply to
unchecked power.
U.S. prisons, or unchecked power. It was an interesting cell. The cell was, this area that we are sitting in, maybe a little bit bigger than that.
Right.
It was all steel, cold steel. The bed was a bunk bed with steel, very thin quarter-inch mattress which had been pressed. And you're basically almost feeling like you're sleeping on the metal. There was a metal toilet with no seat cover or anything like that. The wash basin, steel made out of. The steel door, which is always locked. In the steel door is a slot like this, which is also locked. They open the slot, mealtime, they push a tray in it, and you have to be fast enough to catch it. It might otherwise they'll just drop it. And you have to pick up the food from the cement floor if you want to eat anything. So it was an incredibly, what shall I say? It was there to kill your spirit.
Absolutely.
And one would have thought that solitary confinement would be a very quiet place. You're in your cell, you have nobody to talk to. But it was the noisiest place in the prison because people were going crazy. They would be banging their fists on the door. They would be shouting. They would be, the people next door cell, might be shouting for 4 hours at a stretch. I mean, I couldn't believe what was this cacophony of noise and people going crazy. And that was the kind of place it was. They were, by law, required to take you out for 1 hour a day for some fresh air. And they took you out. It was actually in a cage, roughly the size of this stage.
Wow.
And there was barbed wire fences on all sides and on top. I mean, it's a 20-foot high thing. I don't know what they were expecting. People would escape out of through the sky. But anyway, it was like that. And you could walk back and forth inside that area. It felt like when you've seen these zoo animals in cages, it just felt like that, But I had a novel way of trying to get back to him. I was reasonably powerless, but I had one small power, which was that my appeal was going on, and I could schedule lawyer calls. So I asked for a call with my lawyer, and I told my lawyer to schedule a legal conference
Right.
with me every 3 or 4 days. So what they have to do is they have to come to your cell, they will handcuff you, they will walk you to a conference room, they keep the handcuffs on, you have to hold the phone like this or whatever. But the important part was the guard who put me in the solitary confinement had to come and do this and had to stand outside the conference room till the conference call was going on. So there's a window in this thing. He can't listen to what I'm saying, but he can watch me, and he's supposed to watch me inside the conference room. So every 3 or 4 days, my lawyers would schedule a 2-hour conference call.
Right.
And so I would sit there and I would talk to I was chit-chatting with the lawyers with nothing to discuss. But I was chit-chatting, and after few weeks, after several weeks, he said, I don't understand you. You never ask when you're going to get out of solitary. You never ask what's happening to your, punishment.
Right.
I said, why should I? Solitary confinement is like prison with room service. Food gets delivered, I'm happy, So he said, this is not working. This is not the way we're going to kill his spirit. So they got me out, and they sent me to the maximum security prison because the minimum security was somewhat better conditions.
Sure.
So
Sure.
anyway, I have to say that US has the largest incarcerated population in the world, almost 3 million people. More than 100 million US citizens have directly been affected by incarceration because they're immediate family members of somebody who's gone to prison and so on. So it's a huge problem, and you're not treated with human dignity. It's as very simple as that.
But Rajat, 7 weeks, that's a tall order. The role of spirituality?
No, when I was told I was going to solitary confinement, I grabbed 2 books, which I had, and I had to fight with them to allow me to take them. One was the Bhagavad Gita, and I said, this is my Bible, you will not dare let a Christian not take his Bible, so you have to let me take this book. And the other was a book on light on pranayama by Iyengar. I said, this is a religious practice. So they didn't know. So I said, this is a religious practice. I have to take this book with me. So I took these 2 books, and I must say, for the first time in my life, I read the Bhagavad Gita cover to cover. It was a book with Sanskrit shlok and then Hindi translation and English translation and a commentary. So it's a very wonderful book, actually published by the Ramakrishna Mission.
Right.
It was very interesting because once I was reading that, it put a lot of things in perspective, more than I would have thought. The 3 or 4 things that I took out of it. The book, those of you who have read it would know, there are pieces of it doesn't really apply to modern times. I mean, there's a lot about the sort of caste system in its original form and so on is in the Gita,
Right.
and I didn't care much for it about that part of it, but some of it was really very enlightening, and I'll cite 3 or 4 things that were very good about it. One, those of you who have read it, chapter 2 is my favorite and the richest chapter in terms of philosophy. There were 2 or 3 ideas in that. One was, it's about the soul. It talks about the soul and the everlasting nature of the soul. It's the unity of what is inside you with the greater Brahman. And it puts everything in perspective in the sense of saying, all this is temporal, how does it matter? What is something, the most important thing within me, my Atma is everlasting. It doesn't matter that I stay in solitary confinement or I'm outside or whatever I'm doing. It puts your entire life in perspective. That was a very powerful idea. Another idea was the idea that, you have to deal with the ups and downs of life in a very equanimous way. I mean, it's sort of like, one of the shlokas says, if you can be the same in happiness and in sorrow, then you have really achieved an inner peace.
Absolutely.
And so I just said, okay, it's not, something that is so dramatic. One idea that I always felt in my life and you have been to enough ISB convocations, I always ended with one of the shlokas in chapter 2, which is Karmanye adhikarastu ma phaleshu kadachan ma karma phala hetur bhurma sangosa karmani. You have a right to work, never to the fruits thereof. You should work with the right intentions and do your very best. Then the results don't matter. So I felt I was doing the best I could to fight, so I ended up in solitary confinement. So what? Doesn't matter. And so these kinds of things always gave you a very a feeling of or ability to cope with the situation.
Well, one last question, and this is, we have almost half of this hall filled with our students at Flame University.
Great.
What would be that one or two very important advice that you would like to provide them with, given all these experiences?
One of them I said before, which is that I would go after professional development and not career development. Career development will come automatically. Another one I would say is, no matter how smart you believe you are, you will never be as successful just working yourself and saying that I alone will make the difference, rather than working with a team, making other people successful, and they in turn will make you much more successful. To work through others, work to make other people successful, in turn you'll be much more successful. I would also say, I said this before, if you get too comfortable, take yourself out of the comfort zone. You will only learn when you are out of your comfort zone. So if you get too settled in a position, seek something else. Another thought I would pass on is that don't just concentrate on an immediate job. Think what's around you.
Absolutely.
And you can make a contribution not only in performing your specific job very well, but around the entire system. Whatever it be, and whatever you see, you can improve on, make a contribution. If you read my book, all of you in this audience will see a part of yourself in it. Every one of us. If you wrote a book, I'd probably see part of myself in it. And the reason I wrote this book is not to redeem myself, not to do all that. It has to do with, it's an interesting story. It has a multi-dimensional, interesting story. Everyone can relate to a piece of it. I especially wrote it for the young people who can read it and learn some lessons out of it. And I would say that in the end, I didn't try to do, here's a chapter and here are the 3 lessons. There's nowhere in the book like that. It's not a 10 laws of success or 10 thoughts and, here are the lessons. It's about living that experience and almost by osmosis, absorbing what you would have done in a similar situation, what situations you have faced and how you acted, and learning a little bit from that. That's how I want the learning to be, not here are the 3 rules of success.
Right. No, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Rajat. Well, Rajat has an event and he has to leave by 6:15 latest. I'm just buying 15 extra minutes.
Okay, I'm happy.
So we'll take questions from the floor. Deepshika, is all up to you. Oh, yeah.
So Rajat, thank you for that wonderful revelations and truly appreciate it. Two questions. One, if you can also walk us through how did you come out of that whole mess that you were in? Because I think that last leg was something, if that's in the book, I can read from there. But when you were inside, what was the journey of coming out, and how is that all clear? And what's the current situation with you?
Well, I mean, I was in many ways very fortunate. Most of my fellow prisoners are not that fortunate. I had a very supportive family. They used to visit me all the time. I had enough financial means that I didn't have to worry about, do I have to find a job the next day when I came out and so on. When I came out, I'd already retired when all this happened to me. So it was more about when I came out, it was an interesting adjustment. Part of it was just living back a normal life. In the US, they make it extremely difficult for convicted felons to come out and lead a normal life. I couldn't open a bank account. I can't get a credit card. I can't do many of the normal things you would think I would be able to do. So there are issues in terms of how you deal with it. But I spent most of my time the first year just spending more time with my family, getting back to know my friends and spending time with them. And then I started writing this book. And it was not easy to write. It took me quite a while, and about 18, 24 months to write the book. And some of my appeals were still going on. So I couldn't really finish the book before my appeals was all done with, which only got done this January. So the reason the book is out now is that I could get it out instead of a year ago, let's say.
Thank you. And the next question was that the catastrophe happened on 9/15. I mean, it was 9/11 for WTC, but in the financial world, it was 9/15. When three of those events happened together, Lehman got under the water. Bankham acquired Merrill Lynch, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I was working with Bankham back then, and everybody on the financial market circuit knew that there was this whole call of saving on the Warren Buffett. Either you save Lehman or Goldman Sachs, right? And so there were a lot of players, as you were saying that nobody could find out the faulty players. I mean, the subprime, people could tag it to countrywide, and so on and so forth. And there were a lot of people who testified also. So what was it that you said there was nobody to find the fault in the system, in the subprime crisis itself? I mean, that was the trigger really, right?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but
Okay.
I mean, all these institutions admitted wrongdoing, okay?
Okay.
They all admitted wrongdoing. They were heavily fined, billions of dollars,
Yeah.
the banks.
Yeah.
They admitted wrongdoing, but it's like as if institutions commit wrongdoing
And they can
and
get
no person commits wrongdoing. I mean, how does that happen? I mean, institutions don't just do. So that wasn't the point I was trying to make.
Sure. Thank you.
We'll take one question from there.
Hello, sir. It was great to hear the inspiration and heartwarming description of the Sthatyapagya that you were talking about in Bhagavad Gita. I come from Philips Healthcare. Philips Healthcare. I was leading the mammography business. And before that, I worked in multiple healthcare companies in Danaher and Medtronic in the US. I also met Dr. Reddy from PHFI once, a couple of times. My experience has taught me that we're focusing so much on sick care in the world, especially with the lifestyle diseases being the primary driver of the situation that we're coming across. And a few years across the world, different parts, I learned that, let's say in ancient China, the doctors used to get paid when you will not get sick. So it was like an insurance scheme with the doctors. So I've always been wondering, how do we, turn this thing around, or what is it, or what kind of company, or what kind of entity can actually focus on healthcare rather than sick care?
Yeah. No. The whole idea of the Public Health Foundation was to really focus on preventive and promotive health, not on clinical health. So it's got to do with what are the actions we're going to take to make sure people don't get sick. Because in a poor country like India, you can't afford to have people get sick and then cure them. That is not, will have an impact. It'll be very small. Where you'll have impact is if you really focus on that preventive and promotive care, whether you focus on the first 1,000 days of a child's life in terms of preventive care, nutrition, so on, whether you focus on pregnant women in the early parts of their pregnancy, in fact, start worrying about anemia and other issues that may come up through working on nutrition and so on for young girls starting and when they become mothers, etc. So there's lots of things that are all preventive and promotive in nature, not clinical in nature. That was the objective of PHFI. It was also to direct policies that are, promote health. A very simple example is in India for the longest of times, and I don't know exactly what the issue is now, but cigarettes were taxed, but chewing tobacco and bidis were not taxed because it was considered a cottage industry. Tobacco, everybody knows, is the worst killer in terms of all the diseases that you can think of, whether it's lung cancer or whether it's diabetes and so on. And yet, that was the policy. And, PHFI did the research to try to change that policy, ran into a lot of resistance, but that was the case. And so these important issues need to be tackled in terms of what actions should be taken.
Okay,
So we'll just take one
this
more
is Bharat Vaklu, and Rajat, I know you and Anita have been through a lot, and
Yes.
I think I must compliment you for presenting it so objectively and really this with a lot of equanimity. So thank you very much. Just one question for which I'm curious about. Do you think that capitalism in the US is broken, given the fact that there's an extraordinary pressure to make money without any social concerns or concerns about the environment? Do you really think that capitalism, the way it's headed, and with an overarching criminal justice system, do you think something is broken and might give way very soon?
Well, few observations to make on that. Firstly, capitalism shouldn't be maligned so much because, as they say, I don't know who said it exactly, but they said that capitalism is probably a difficult or bad situation, but we haven't found any better. So in some ways, capitalism is here to stay, and it aligns human incentive and human endeavor. But capitalism functions only when there is effective regulation and when there is effective safety nets. So in society, you must have the kind of safety nets that are needed, especially in health and education. Those are fundamental human rights. So those safety nets must exist. Effective regulation to create an even playing field rather than crony capitalism has to exist. And then capitalism is a good system. If you think about the biggest fundamental change in human history, in human development for the better, was in a political system, in an economic system, was China, where 800 million people came out of poverty into middle class. That's the single biggest thing over 20 years. It came through adopting capitalism in a way, in a socialist society. Now, it needs the safety net, as I said. The other observation I'd make is that income inequality has been growing dramatically all around the world, even in India. You cannot sustain that over the long term. It will surely lead to social unrest. It will surely lead to an unfair society. And if we don't check that, and it has dramatically grown in the last 2 decades or so, if we don't check that, we're going to run into deep problems. So But we are acting quite the opposite. I mean, if you look at in the US terms, if you look at the recent tax code changes, that is going exactly in the opposite direction, you know. So that needs to be, I think, checked. In terms of global trade is a very good thing. And again, there needs to be effective regulation. I would say China took advantage of it and manipulated currency, etc., for a long time. And we see the backlash of that. But in general, global trade creates great amount of wealth and improves the standard of living of, you know, the globally in the trading partners. So those are the types of qualifiers I would make in terms of capitalism. But capitalism is here to stay.
Well, folks, just one last question, and then
So,
we'll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajat, for a wonderful narrative of yours. By the way, I'm Ramesh Sharma, and I'm a former Director General of Police. And I used to be also Director General of Economic Offences Wing and Anti-Corruption Bureau. So I'm quite aware of these fraud cases. Good to hear firsthand what you had to say on this issue. But there's one particular thing that is intriguing my mind, and that is that what is the reason why your lawyers did not want you to testify? What was the reason? Was it something to do with plea, that there was some bargaining going on with the prosecution to reduce the sentence? Because as I know, corporate security fraud is almost 20 years there, and conspiracy is 5 years. So was it there was some give and take there? Or secondly, also about Preet Bharara, because we know in India Preet Bharara very well because of that diplomat case, lady diplomat case that happened, and we had followed that case very closely, and we found that he had gone hammer and tongs in a manner that was perhaps would not be done even in India.
Right.
So was there some, I'm sorry to say this, was there some element of color of the skin also that came into play?
So let me answer the second question first, and then I'll answer the second. I don't think it honestly had to do anything to do with my being Indian. I don't believe that. It had to do much more in her case, which I felt was so unfair and so ridiculous in terms of what was done to her. In terms of the first question, I don't think there was any dialogue going on between my lawyers and the prosecutors, zero. It is generally, in the US, lawyers would say, don't testify. I mean, 90% of the cases, that's the advice they give. And you have to be very strong to say, I want to testify. There was one other thing which is actually not in the book that I'll say because I didn't want to name the person. There was a very famous Wall Street person who, and I won't name the person, who was in a securities issue, was found guilty. And I knew him well, so I called him, and he's giving me general advice on how to approach things and so on. Then he told me, whatever circumstance, don't testify. He said, I was winning the case, then I chose to testify, and the jury thinking that here's a rich guy trying, the case went the other way. I had that in the back of my mind also. And they also said, if you testify and the jury still finds you guilty, then your sentence will be longer because then the judge will think you lied in front of the court. So there were these sort of little complications in that. But I have to say also one other thing. The prosecutors asked for a very long sentence in my case, more than 10 years. And I received, in the US judicial system, after you're found guilty, before sentencing, people can write letters of support, how they got to know you, etc. And I got 400 to 500 letters of support, more than 400. The judge said, in his entire judicial career of 30 years, he had never come across a case where so many people were willing to stand up and vouch for my character and vouch for things I had done. I think that's why I got a 2-year sentence, not because the prosecutors were making a deal. The prosecutors wanted more than 10 years.
All right. Thank you very much, Rajat, for this heart-to-heart conversation.